I'm really happy to be talking about solutions. In fact, I have three things I want to talk about today, and I'm going to try to just spend a few minutes on each one. Communication research, the application to parks and places we love, and then a recent project that kind of puts it all into practice. So I started working in climate change communication in the early 2000s, and at that time, I just couldn't understand why people didn't want to talk about climate change or global warming or whatever we were calling it. And I wanted to know why. So I started this little hobby project where I gathered empirical peer-reviewed research on climate change communication. And so just as climate scientists were cranking out research on everything from atmospheric chemistry to zoonotic disease, social scientists were exploring the cultural, social, and linguistic aspects of communicating climate change. And since 2004, there's been more than 3,000 studies on already 65 in this early part of 2021. So when we look at this research, it's really sliced and diced a dozen different ways. These studies tend to be really interdisciplinary. They draw on diverse perspectives, methods, data sets, and they can be found in a wide range of publishing outlets. You know, communication is a really broad idea, so we see these communities of research in everything from the attitudes and values to how issues are framed or portrayed visually or via technology. And there's a legacy of research on media reporting and case studies of communities across the globe. And there's been this resurgence in social marketing research and the role that it can play in helping people adopt sustainable behaviors. And what's really clear from more than 15 years and 3,000 studies is that there are some things that just don't work. Fear appeals and doomsday prophecies. The minute the disaster or potential for disaster dissipates, the public returns to their everyday concerns. When we wake up and there isn't a cataclysmic storm, we just continue to live our life the way we always did without making any systemic or behavioral changes. Also, for more than 100 years, journalists have been trained to balance their news stories. For every issue, they must present support and evidence for the other side. So when it comes to climate change, we see 97% or more of actively publishing climate scientists agreeing that warming trends over the past century are likely due to human activity on the planet. But only 28% of news stories actually reflect that scientific consensus, making the issue seem way more controversial than it really is. So this challenges the public. Also, the language we use. One of my favorite studies comes from a survey of looking at the words used in IPCC reports and what the public hears when they see them. So when we see aerosol, we think a spray can, hairspray. If someone has a theory, it's just a hunch. If there's a level of uncertainty in the study, well, then that means you don't know. So you must be ignorant about the actual issue. And if you have a manipulation in your data, then you must have tampered it with it in some way. If there's an error, even a margin of error, then you must have done something wrong or you've made a mistake. And I love this one when you say you've got consensus. Well, that means you share an opinion. And if we tell the public that something is likely, they think, it's probably not going to happen. So language really matters. And on top of that, these stories that we tell, global stories of coastal villages in the Maldives or animals suffering in the Arctic, you know, cue the polar bear, stranded on the ice floe, starving, cute. We want to save them. But research shows that feeling is very temporary, and we go back to living our life the way we always did. So those are a few things that don't work. Just in summary, don't use fear appeals and doomsday prophecies. Don't arbitrarily balance your story. Try to avoid the technical and scientific jargon unless you're defining it and teaching it. Predictions couched in uncertainty leave us feeling more confused, and references to animal and people far away. So from that research, what works? And this really brings me to this other line of research I've been spending some time in. I want you to think for a moment about a place that you love. It could be a national park, it could be a sidewalk in your neighborhood. It is a place that you love, a place you can picture, a place that you can smell, that you can see. These places evoke feelings, and when we look at place attachment and sense of place literature, we know that places are really powerful. So about a decade ago, I started this project with the National Park Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to figure out how can we communicate climate change at these parks with both visitors, staff, and decision makers. So this work took me all across the country. It was kind of a great gig, more than 24 national parks and wildlife refuges. And in fact, it led to this book project that recently finished, just came out last year. And this is not entirely or exclusively about climate change, but it is about the power of place-based learning. And I'll put a link to it in the chat. In fact, we did a special issue of Park Stewardship Forum. It's also a journal out of the University of California Press who published this, but it's an open source journal that has tons of great research related to the power of place and climate change. There's several case studies that are climate change in there. So the project has more than 21 chapters that really test the from Washington, D.C., San Francisco Bay. We look at these cities where there's historical memorials and the impact of from the American Revolution, the Civil War, civil rights, but also the grand landscapes of the Grand Tetons and Yellowstone and Rocky. And the book challenge us is to think differently about both climate change and citizen science curriculum and how that dynamic learning leads students to a more engaged and meaningful understanding of things, but really they're places that matter to them. So the chapters and the case studies provide evidence that learning about these ecosystem dynamics and understanding climate change in this context of place helps people feel more empowered and think more critically about their own consumption and conservation choices. And in my chapter, I share results from a really big, again, that traveling to all those different parks. We surveyed more than 4,000 visitors and used a combination of a place attachment scale and the 6 Americas. I'm assuming you're familiar with the 6 Americas studies. It's a national survey that George Mason and Yale University do every other year. And they divide, essentially it's climate concern broken out across 6 dimensions. Anyways, the point was we asked those same questions and we found that people feel really connected to places even if it's their first visit. So when we ask them, is this place special, to be over 80%. So, you're visiting a park, it's going to be special. Okay. Nearly 60% agree or strongly agree that they feel responsible. So they have this sense of personal ownership of the issues. And then when we drill down to climate change, do you feel responsible for contributing to the condition of the climate? Again, over 50% agree. And they feel responsible. They recognize that their personal behaviors and choices are connected to the larger global system. And what was really exciting is we asked, are you willing to change your behavior to help reduce the impacts? So solutions, are you willing to engage in solutions? Overwhelmingly, again, nearly 70% were very or extremely willing. And in fact, in follow-ups, we found out they wanted the park or the wildlife refuge to show them how. Show us what you're doing. How are you mitigating your impact? How are you reducing your carbon footprint? What are some things? We see that you no longer have plastic water bottles, or the gift store doesn't carry bags. Tell us about that. And what's really exciting is with nearly 4,000 people, we found no significant statistical difference in political party affiliation. So whether people identified as a Republican, an independent, or a Democrat, it didn't change the level of concern that they had about climate change. In general, the group of people who visit these places were concerned, and it didn't change their sense of attachment to the place. So we thought that was really important because we often see this as like a politically divisive issue, but it turns out that we have more in common than we don't. The next piece was a series of interviews that we did. We did more than 360 interviews with visitors and really asked them, where do you get your climate change information? What's your number one source? And just through, again, very open-ended conversation interviews, friends and family members. So people trust the people they know for climate change information, more so than the media, definitely not a politician. So that we thought was really powerful. The other thing that came out in the interviews is that people were processing climate change in different ways. And as we started to look at it, it really sounded like these stages of grief. So if you're familiar with the stages of grief, people process loss and trauma in different ways. And we started to hear that over and over and over. And I think that this really helped me think about audiences and how they're processing this global moment and potentially this transition, and how to help, in your job as a climate change educator, as a scientist, a natural resource expert or manager. What do you want people to know about climate change? And above the board, they wanted to get people to acceptance. They're like, we need to move people out of denial down the path to accepting this so we can move to solutions. They also want people to know that you don't need to know everything about climate change to start taking action. It would take an entire lifetime, 10 lifetimes, to read all the research on climate change. So you're going to be paralyzed by that. So let's make a move. Let's recognize that we don't need to know everything to start doing this. Visitors feel empowered, letting them know that little things do matter. I think lots of us recognize how huge and global this problem is, and we feel like, I'm so insignificant. How could me riding my bike to work or switching my light bulbs even make a lick of difference? And we need to keep reminding each other that every little bit counts. And the more we talk about those little things we're doing, the more it's going to bring our community up, and it's going to create that ripple that's really important for social change. So I guess the third part of this conversation that I wanted to tell you about is related to a project I just finished. It was called a Coastlines and People project. I get to live in Marquette, and it is special because it's a place I love, and I've loved it for a long time. And yes, I have paddleboarded to work. I ironically get asked that. So one thing that happened with this Coastlines and People project is we brought together 70 scientists, elected officials, representatives from our city, county, and state government, and started to build a story of our coastline and the impacts of climate change. And we asked, what coastal changes have you noticed? And immediately it was clear that across that one, there were several changes, but from property loss, vegetation loss, road damage. In fact, right here in Marquette, maybe you can see in the cover of this book, which I'll give a link to, we just moved our Lakeshore Boulevard. We had to move it in because it was getting eaten by the lake. And so this is paramount. It is, again, something that everyone in the community was noticing, regardless of political affiliation, regardless of job, regardless of development, pro-development attitudes. And so we hosted a series of workshops that kind of started to get at what are some of the concerns, and people really are worried about storms and the damage that storms have, erosion, eroding, reduced ice cover. We're actually in a reduced ice cover year right now, which affects our fish populations, and then rip currents. So the lake is at the center of this community. This is how we talk. We have lots of words for Mama Superior. But the bigger question was, how will climate change affect us? And we moved into a scenario planning process where we said, what does the next 5 years out look like? Let's envision it. Let's draw it. Let's talk about it. What does 10 years from now look like? What does 15 years from now look like? And as we started to push our participants to create these visions, we realized that main drivers to change in our community. And the first was changing lake levels. We just don't know. The lake might be low this year. That's the prediction, but it's been really, really high for the past 6 years. And we also don't know about development. There's a surge in tourism. Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore had more tourism, more tourist visits this summer during the pandemic than ever before on record. It was a record-breaking year for tourism here. So we start to put these drivers into conversation with each other, and using a scenario planning process, we made a grid on both ends of the spectrum. And what this did was it helped us start to talk about different scenarios. A very passive approach to the future adaptation planning would be just kind of letting things go, letting it figure out, it's 5 years from now, we'll see, the wait and see. Or managed retreat, like the picture of Lakeshore Boulevard, we start to pull back and we figure out what are some of our priority assets as a community that need to move back. Or we armor the shore, just like start dumping riprap and concrete and buffer it up. Or invest in some green build and some more permeable surfaces that can allow the lake to lift and rise as appropriate. Anyways, all that was important about this was that it initiated some conversations that we hadn't had as a community before. And we started finding scientists and data to help us build out these stories, but we realized we needed to visualize them. And so we hired these designers, these landscape architect and designers, and they helped us turn these ideas into pictures. Once we had the pictures, we had the city commission, the planning commission, everyone on board because of the visual power of looking at a place and a place that they love. And then to start having these conversations, well, it's not just managed retreat. It's not just passive. It's not just a green build. And so the nuance started to evolve, and we were able to say, okay, scenarios, our future is going to include elements of each of these pieces of the quadrant. Each one of those is going to play a role. And so that's what the Coastlines and People project is about. It's really special to me because I took everything I knew about communicating climate change and I was able to put it into this community that I really love. So I guess the punchline, if you want to communicate climate solutions, talk about it with the people you love in the context of the places you love. And that is what makes me happy. Thank you very much.